Today, I come with another cautionary tale from Yasha Levine. We're going to be talking about his essay, Matt Taibbi Gobbled Up by the Vampire Squid in the Vampire Castle. Now, Yasha's been writing on expanding basically Mark Fisher's Vampire Castle to something new, the way it interacts in this form of cultural debate, which really came before that in very niche activist and or college circles amongst really people somewhat insulated from a lot of the regular world, spread out like madness through the entirety of our culture. Furthermore, Matt Taibbi is an interesting figure. My former supervisor over at Zero Books used to love Matt and still does, even after they've had similar trajectories. And I used to defend Matt Taibbi in his Exiled and Rolling Stone days. I've even done a whole piece with J.G. Michaels of Parallax Views on our mutual podcast Alternatives back, which was behind the paywall at Zero Books in 2018, on some of the weaknesses in Matt Taibbi's arguments, but why we'd still defend them as at least something kind of interesting from the Gen X journalism left. But even before 2020, we started seeing something going wrong, and JG and I almost regretted that episode before it even came out. Yasha is tangential to a lot of the same spaces Matt Taibbi used to move in. Radio War Nerd, where I discovered Yasha first, or at least in that tangential orbit, was very much kind of a post-exiled milieu. But Yasha has a lot of good things to say about this and really does do some interesting theoretical work, even if we're going to have to add to it. Let's get straight into the article. You can find this on Yasha's Nefarious Russians Substack, and I would definitely tell you guys to check it out. Lots of people are going nuts at just how shitty Matt Taibbi has become. People are shocked at how low one of the most celebrated investigative journalists of Gen X America has fallen, to the point that now Matt Taibbi doesn't seem like a real person. I mean, many people today don't seem like a real person. One of the things with audience cancer capture, although cancer may be a good way to think about it, is that often you become a stereotype of yourself. And Taibbi's got it almost terminally. He's like an LLM model that was trained on Matt Taibbi writing style, but has been programmed to output content semantically a hybrid of Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, and Sarah Palin. Much of it is just brain-dead Reagan-era slogans with words like fuck and pussy and moron thrown in to give it a Gen X edge. His new devoted Substack fan base, and I am fascinated by people's Substack fan base. Friend of the show, Daddy Freddie DeBoer, also has a fascinatingly at odds with itself Substack fan base, which now numbers in the hundreds of thousands and brings him millions a year, gobbles up this stuff. And yet there is some pushback. You can sometimes see it in the comment section. Some of his longtime fans feel that something is off now, that something happened. What exactly? The other week, one of these complaining readers wrote to Matt, and Matt replied to them publicly in a post titled, "What Am I For?" He wanted to address the charge that he had somehow changed. Long quote. I do a lot of ridiculing here, and I don't advocate for much. But to answer seriously, it's strange to ask if someone is a convert to fucking vicious, evil, and stupid predatory capitalism, since it presupposes that I started out as something other than a capitalist, which most Americans, including those ostensibly socialist podcasters, naturally are. Yeah. We all live in a capitalist society, so you can pretend that since we can't escape that, we're naturally the thing that we live in. And to some degree, that's true. And to some degree, who gives a fuck? Because you're a liberal too, Matt. But I'm getting mad at Matt. He doesn't know me. And I wouldn't want to know his bald ass. I'm certainly no zealot about it, but I favor free markets. Sure you do. Because I like the idea of people starting their own restaurant or bank or rock band or whatever and being rewarded if they do a good job. A beautiful thing when it happens. Yeah. We all know the libertarian myths. They don't really happen anymore because people don't have the startup capital to do that, and are the power law access required to build that stuff anymore. I'm not in favor of big enterprises like Goldman Sachs or GM being stopped by the government and insulated from failure when smaller companies don't enjoy the same privilege. I mean, I also not in favor of them being insulated from failure. In fact, I would love to see more of them fail. I don't think everything should be private, and I do favor some relief programs to take the harder edges off the free market system, though I think those work better when they're universally available. I mean, I would too. That's why I'm a socialist. Although socialism isn't just when the government gives you stuff, it's when the workers are in charge. But yeah, we'll come back to that later. I think the government should be a small and prioritize protecting rights and freedoms over solving the world's problems. In short, I'm what used to be called a moderate, aka a spineless hack. Anyway, and believe society isn't that far from being in great shape. You, really, Matt? Oh my God. If we could just calm down and find fixes for a problem or two, we could learn to appreciate the answers. I hope that answers your question. In short, Matt says his politics has never changed. He's always been in favor of small government, and that if capitalism allowed to run as it should be, everything would be okay. I've read Matt here and there for years, and I know this isn't exactly true. He began his political reporting career at the Exile in Moscow, a paper I also worked for after Matt decamped for America to become a serious political reporter. And what made the Exile, which was founded by my good friend Mark Ames, infamous and different from other non-Russian newspapers operating out of Moscow, was that it was firmly against the capitalist looting of Russia. That neoliberal shock doctrine, backed by the full might of the U.S. government, turned Russia into a pure expression of capitalists as you could possibly imagine. A small government run by a fully capitalist class fucking everyone else. This Russian experiment quickly being replicated here in the United States, with the oligarchy vastly wealthier and more powerful and more out of control and bent on looting. Matt has little to say about the oligarchic looting of America today, and yet he was clearly against it in Russia. I'm going to refrain from making fun of his appearance, even though I failed earlier. To be fair, I actually liked a Matt Taibbi book that I bought around 2007, 2008 about the problems with truthers in the left, on the liberal left, particularly when Naomi Wolf was becoming a weirdo in relation to the Bush administration. And Naomi Wolf has been doing this weird stuff way before Naomi Klein started writing about her, or before she got banned from Twitter or any of that. To get a better sense of how Matt changed, I went back to his more recent and more famous work, a big article he did for Rolling Stone on how Goldman Sachs is a vampire squid. It's interesting to see how he wrote about Goldman Sachs back when he was a rock star progressive liberal journalist, rather than a rock star conservative MAGA pundit that he is today, although he'll deny it. You wouldn't be surprised to learn that he was very much against the obrided capitalism that Goldman Sachs represented. To be fair, that's not even against what he said. His focus wasn't on how the government should be small, it was on how Goldman Sachs had effectively taken over the government, making the government subservient to its interests, corrupting and gutting the regulatory state that was supposed to limit Wall Street speculation and thievery. His whole point in the article was not that the government was bad and that it should be shrunk to the size of a peanut so that the true free market can flourish, but that the outsized power of corporations had corrupted American society, creating a system of legalized extortion, fueling a series of disastrous speculative bubbles, and robbing regular people at every turn. He wasn't optimistic about free markets like he is today, when it's really hard to be optimistic about free markets, I may add personally. He was gloomy and defeatist, concluding that we are run by a bunch of capitalist criminals who turn America into a gangster state and who rob us at every turn. Long quote. from the old Matt Taibbi. It's not always easy to accept the reality of what we now routinely allow these people to get away with. There's a kind of collective denial that kicks in when a country goes through what America has gone through lately, when people lose as much prestige and status as we have in the past few years. Oh my God, if you only knew, Matt, how bad it was going to be, but then that you would be on the other side of this equation. Anyway, you can't really register the fact that you're no longer a citizen of a thriving first world democracy. I mean, that you really never have been. But again, we'll come back. That you're no longer getting robbed in broad daylight, because like an amputee, you can still sort of feel things that are no longer there. But this is it. This is the world we live in now. And in this world, some of us have to play by the rules and others get a note from the principal excusing them from homework till the end of time, plus $1 billion free dollars in a paper bag to buy lunch. It's a gangster state running on gangster economics, and even prices can't be trusted anymore. There are hidden taxes in every buck you pay, and maybe we can't stop it, but we should at least know where it's all going. Now, asterisk, you could reconcile this with some real thought pretzels to what Matt Taibbi said, what he stands for now against big corporations and whatnot. But the problem is, the big corporations come from the little corporations that he's pushing for. Although he doesn't say it outright, it's pretty clear that Mac back then was making a case for a robust regulatory government system that would keep capitalism in check and make sure markets work for everyone. He even used the term democratic capitalism at some point in the article, which is also always a stupid idea. This was a position that someone like Bernie Sanders would no doubt endorse. Bernie Sanders would call it democratic socialism, but it's the same thing. And Sanders and Matt had seen eye to eye before, with Sanders blurting Matt's book and calling him one of the few journalists in America who speaks truth to power. And I don't know about you, but favoring government regulation seems a bit different from what Matt believes now, that the government should be small, a phrase that could be lifted from a policy paper put out by Charles Cox, Oligarchic Libertarian Cato Institute. So what does this switch in Matt Taibbi's politics represent? Well, to me, it signals two things. There's the issue of audience capture, which I mentioned, audience cancer, and also the fundamental malleability of people's politics. As I wrote before, Matt got canceled by the libs, and so he moved to the right. I mean, this happens all the time. Have the gall to be canceled and stand up and stay where you are. That's my challenge to people getting canceled. Well, to clarify, he moved to the right. He first begged the libs to take him back, blaming all the bad things he had written on an old friend and throwing himself to the mercy of the liberal oppressors. The old friend was probably Limontoff. I can't remember. That didn't work, so he moved right. The right didn't embrace him the way I suspect he did not expect, because they always embrace traitors. All the way back to Whittaker Chambers. This is a long game. Hell, all the way back to like Edmund fucking Burke. His screeds against liberals kept him getting attention, money, and adulation. And the more adulation and money he got from the right, the more he felt like an intellectual rock star in those circles. Many, many such cases. The more he moved to the right and the more conservative and towards conservative libertarian politics. It's a classic move at this point. It was a classic move in the 1940s. This is a long history of this. I could go over and over and over it. This is where the malleability of people's politics comes into play. Matt wasn't just pandering to his new audience, although the pandering was there for sure, especially at first. More than anything, he was allowing the underdeveloped right-wing ideological aspect of his identity to flower, to fully blossom into the bright, nourishing light of Ted Cruz and Elon Musk. That's right. Even when he was in the liberal cultural camp, the libertarian conservative side was always there. Yeah, it was. I've actually talked about this, even in my defense of Matt Taibbi 7 years ago. You can get the glimpse of it in his Vampire Squared article, with oblique references to an ideal capitalist democratic America, a society governed passively by free markets and free elections, aka lies that Gen Xers like to tell themselves to go to sleep at night. But this side of his political cultural identity was repressed by the liberal cultural environment in which Matt operated and on which he depended for his prestige, self-worth, cultural status, and work. And his Black Lives Matter Kente kneeling. Oh my God, he did that? Oh, part of Matt's career he doesn't want you to remember us hallucinated by that lying chat GPT. Oh, thank God. I was like, I don't think he did that. Matt is a rich kid with a famous journalist father. Why is everyone a fucking Nepo baby? Even people that I've worked for that I didn't think were Nepo babies, they often discover that they're Nepo babies. Fail sons and Nepo babies everywhere. Peter Turchin damned us correctly. See off a theory of elites and elite overproduction. When he ended his father's profession and tried to make it mainstream, he gravitated towards progressive liberal side of the political culture because that's where the energy and coolness and opportunities were. And it worked for him. When he got the Rolling Stone gig, he was marketed as a direct heir to Hunter S. Thompson, particularly after Hunter S. Thompson shot himself. He churned out articles in the progressive liberal mode with a bit of HST branded spunk and aggressiveness thrown in. And the liberal media establishment loved him and embraced him for it. Matt was held up as one of the most important voices of his generation. Yeah, I remember doing that too. At the peak of his loving relationship with the Prague liberal side of American culture, he even wrote a BLM-inflected book about the killing of Alec Gardner and police brutality, I Can't Breathe. I remember that, and I remember there being so many of them, I didn't read it. You could say it was peak liberalism on Matt's part, similar to Nancy Pelosi bending the knee in the wake of BLM. I doubt he even had any real care for the black and poor people at the Gestapo end of America's law and order system. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate on that. He may have not. But that's where the liberal energy was at the time. Absolutely. That's what got the attention and praise from the liberal media and publishing industry. He got rave reviews from every liberal newspaper and magazine in America. The book marked the peak of Matt's Prague liberal journalism and the moment of his undoing. During a national book tour, and this is when I actually defend Taibbi, Matt was asked some uncomfortable questions about what he'd written about women, and everything rapidly deteriorated for him. In short, he was canceled, banished from the liberal moral island. Good thing those of us who don't live there don't get hit by that, but I also don't say such things about women, so I don't have that problem either way. You can read my definitive essay on what happened after Matt's cancellation and the base way he tried to claw his way back into liberal fold. Do I need to cover another article by? Well, we'll come back to that. Banished by the libs, Matt began to develop other parts of his identity. In the right-wing conservative flank of America's cultural identity, cultural political formation. Yeah, what I used to call the Whittaker Chambers problem, which also tells you how old this is. This right-wing conservative flank always existed inside him. All it needed was the right social professional environment to express itself. To put it in a cruder way, Matt's political convictions were always tied to where the opportunity and idolation was coming from, as most journalists are. Not all, but most. This is why I don't make my living doing this. I know what the incentives are. I see where it goes. I've had people who were darlings of the left tell me in private that they were going to become anti-progressives to get another end of the market. Just flat out, I've been told that. Now, I'm not a progressive myself, but I would never make pivoting my political identity based on what's popular or not. But then again, that's probably why I'm not that popular. He's flexible. He can be more progressive or more conservative depending on the cultural professional circumstances that surrounded him. If he had never been canceled, he'd still be a liberal now, writing screeds about Trump and Steve Miller and ICE raids and making fun of Elon Musk's expensive cone-over rather than being Musk toady. All that aside, I don't think Matt is uniquely corrupt. No, he's part of the incentive system of the media that existed even before online media, but that's online media just exacerbated all the contradictions in our culture. He's corrupt in a way a lot of people are corrupt. Most people hold contradictory ideas and political views and moral stances in their heads. I mean, even I probably do. You guys can probably find them if you look hard enough. We're not rational in our beliefs, and allegiances aren't set in stone. I don't even know that we know what rationality is. That's a long debate for another day. A lot of people think they know what rationality is, and they mean either common sense or formal logic or whatever I feel that day. I don't know. In short, our politics are social. Absolutely. And Matt's been very well socialized by the MAGA right, wined and dined and made richer than ever. Not so much Fisher in here, but there is some truth about the way these incentives move you to fight in certain ways in the culture war, because a lot of people's positions in the culture war are not based on deeply held beliefs. They're based on signaling to people they want to belong to. Everybody virtue and vice signals. The problem is if that's all your politics is. I think I'm going to read a second piece by Yasha. Let's go into his piece on Matt from 2020. We'll just post this as an addendum. Matt is a cancel culture hypocrite. Here's what Matt hopes you don't remember. When the cancel mob came for him, he was an upper-class Twitter Robespierre ratting on his colleagues. Ooh, this is mean. Between the pandemic, the economic collapse, the fires, and the toxic fumes, and the fact that I'm currently fighting an eviction, I know there are much more pressing issues to get worked up about these days. But someone who got his start in journalism at the Exiled and who has been on the receiving end of our cancel culture so many times I lost count, I can't let it go. This summer, you probably saw Matt Taibbi lighting up the internet with his moral crusade against America's cancel culture. He's been praised by blue checks on the left, the center, the right, and the alt-right for having the courage to go against the grain and tell it like it is. Courage, I'd like to point out, he seems to have discovered only after a bunch of celebrity centrists got together to widespread acclaim to wage a coordinated insurgency against cancel culture in the pages of the respected pubs like Harper's, the New York Mag, and the New York Times. We can talk about the strengths of Matt's arguments and his rhetorical skills, and I'll get into that in greater detail later. But if you ask me, his constant sucking up to the gross establishment pundits, his constant cliches, his angry dad takes snarling about kids these days, and how everything was better and purer in the 1960s before he was even a fucking issue, and his rants about the glorious rational enlightenment, oh my God, I get tired of those things, threatened by the dastardly radical left, it's all been very embarrassing and common. And I've even seen my friends do this shit, and most of them are former friends now. Back to Yasha. Matt went from helping set up what is probably the most radical and avant-garde literary experiment of his generation to sounding like a caricature of a reactionary boomer at the tender age of 50. So he definitely wasn't at issue in the 60s. God, he's not even that much older. He's only a decade older than me. Sad. I mean, just look at how Matt talks about cancel culture with the alt-right weirdo Brett Weinstein. Dialing in from his office, which is decked out with the cool drum kit and framed Rolling Stone covers, Matt explains that cancel culture is actually a Bolshevik-like bacillus infecting our institutions, and we got to get it out. We know this long frame. I think that's because I don't... One quote from Matt. I think that's because I don't recognize how serious it is. Again, it's similar to what happened in Russian history. No, it's fucking not. People thought that this little clan of, super motivated Bolsheviks were never going to go anywhere because even within the relatively small minority of socialists who were very active, they were considered nuts. Not always. You also don't know much about the Narodnikis and the SRs if you think the Bolsheviks were the only people considered nuts. But they had a way of thinking that was difficult for people in an institutional setting. Yeah, people can just assert shit. Have you guys ever noticed? I teach people all day to back up their claims, and then you have a culture of journalists who just don't fucking do that. Anyway, back to this. They had a way of thinking that was very difficult to counter in an institutional setting. This is the kind of similar thing, I think, and people are seeing this, that once this gets into an institution, it's really difficult to oppose. Bolsheviks? That's what things like the New York Times Tom Cotton op-ed cancellation events are all about. It makes no sense. Hell, Matt doesn't even get his basic Russian history right. Yeah, I know, he doesn't. It's fucking pathetic. But like I said, I want to put aside the issues of substance and style for now and get at something that's a lot more basic here. Something about Matt that everyone seems to have forgotten. Matt might be full of zeal and anti-cancel courage now when most of America's establishment is already fighting the same fight right along with him. I mean, they made Barry Weiss a thing. But when taking a stand against politicized smear campaigns and cancel culture actually mattered, when it affected him and those around him personally, he didn't stand on principle, nor did he fight the cancel mob. What Matt did do was this. He lied. Ooh. Blamed someone else for things he had actually did and then tried to get someone else canceled instead of him. That's what Matt doesn't want you to remember. Not that long ago, he took part in cancel culture, all in an attempt to save his own skin. To understand what I'm talking about, you got to go back to 2017, which to me seems like yesterday, but I'm getting old. That year, Matt was on the receiving end of a nasty online smear campaign in which he was painted as a rapist and a dangerous sexual harasser. Am I supposed to say a rapist like the kids do? I mean, I was on X today and somebody was putting a star in killed as if they were going to get censored on X because they've trained themselves to think like a coward on TikTok. Anyway, the smears were total bullshit. They were based on some highly decontextualized satire that he and Mark Ames put out when he was editing The Exile, a cult satirical newspaper that they ran back in Moscow in the 1990s and early 2000s. The smears had no basis in fact, but that didn't really matter. The campaign was being whipped up by a bunch of Democratic Party hacks and activists and their suggestible dupes. Oh my God. Don't listen to anyone who's a Democratic Party dupe, particularly if they're paid by some Democratic Party establishment group with millionaires behind it. Still reeling from the shock of Trump's victory. They had been hating on Matt because of his skeptical reporting on Russiagate, which was always overstated. And I was actually pathetic to Matt on that. And on the Dem Party's cynical embrace of xenophobia and conspiracy mongering as a way of deflecting blame from Hillary Clinton's spectacular failure in 2016. I mean, you can still see this today in Kamala Harris calling Trump a communist dictator. What is it UC said on X? America has two right-wing parties calling each other communist. Matt had a big audience and a lot of credibility, probably the most mainstream credibility of any Russiagate critic. He was effective and people listened to him, and the Democratic Party nomenclatura absolutely hated him for it because he was considered one of those. Oh, look, it's an old Yasha treat. Clinton and the DNC people bring up satire from 20 years ago to smear Matt Taibbi for his recent critical reporting on our Russia hysteria. That's from 2017. Yasha defending Matt. Good on Yasha. I defended Matt in 2018 for the same reasons. The stuff they were hurling at Matt on Twitter and on Reddit was gross and ugly and downright libelous. I remember it all very well. In fact, I defended him at the time. Hey, so did I. Was myself attacked because of it, called a rapist, apologist, and worse. I wasn't. I've been called a lot of bad things, but I've never been called that. That's probably because I went a different way with all that. My book, Surveillance Valley, was about to come out, and I knew that coming to his defense could easily get me and the book canceled, but I did it anyway. I did it on principle and in solidarity, even though I barely knew Matt personally. The campaign against Matt kept circulating for months. Then in October 2017, Bolsheviks? All right, anyway. Just when Matt's new book was getting a lot of good press and he went on a book tour, the smears got ramped up, and then he finally hit their target. His book tour was scrapped. A popular podcast he had just started running with a former Gawker got canned. Was that Useful Idiots? I don't remember which one he was running at that time. Matt managed to hold on to his job at Rolling Stone, but other than that, he turned into an untouchable ghoul. It was brutal to watch how quickly so many of his colleagues turned their backs on him publicly. We saw a lot of that. Picture from Dan Whitcomb, U.S. journalist faces sexual harassment for over memoir. Los Angeles, Reuters. This Rolling Stone journalist and author canceled one of his 2 book appearances at the Humanities Festival in Chicago on Saturday after a backlash over a memoir co-wrote in 2000, which critics say recounted sexual harassment of female employees. Matt Taibbi, the author of the new book about the death of a 43-year-old black man, Eric Gardner, at the hands of the New York Police Department, was unable to attend the Chicago Humanities Festival due to scheduling demands, the organizer said. The ridiculous thing about it is that, despite all the articles accusing Matt of sexual harassment, no one actually bothered to do any reporting on these accusations. Journalists simply recycled the same offending screen grabs from Mark and Matt's own satirical writing, aka they were tweet stenographers, which is what journalists in the late 2010s became. No wonder they got replaced with Substack or whatever the fuck is going on in cable news today, which is not even that. They don't even tweet stenographer anymore. They just run their fucking mouths. I mean, look, I run my fucking mouth, but I don't get paid millions a year for it. If they had done the reporting, they would have discovered that there were no accusations, and nor were there any actual accusers. They didn't exist, as subsequent reporting by Walter Bragman had demonstrated. Well, maybe one victim did exist. The New York Times journalist Michael Wines, who at the time was based in Moscow and who Matt had tagged in a face with a horse farm pie back in 2001 for being a reactionary hack whose offense was writing puff pieces on Putin and his KGB background. Oh, God, do you remember when New York Times did that? Yeah, me too. Most people don't, though, because the gray lady has consistently sucked forever. All right. And when I point that out, I used to be called a conservative. There's some things that even when I was a conservative in my early 20s that I hated then that I hate now. Woodrow Wilson and the New York Times, I hated them. I hate them now. Anyway, I guess getting horse sperm squished all over your face could technically count as a kind of sexual harassment. I repeat, there was never a victim or an accuser. There was only satirical material, cartoonishly offensive at times, as everyone expected of the Exile back then. It was a step above Charlie Hebdo at that time. When it was written, and only years later, and taken out of context and weaponized against its authors. The attacks against Matt were so blatantly dishonest, failing to even follow even a basic J-school source checking, that if you look at the same articles today, you'll see a good number of them have already been corrected to remove the references to the supposed harassment charges, including outlets like Newsweek, The Nation, and The Guardian. As Mark Ains explained at the peak of the smear campaign back in 2017, these accusations came from his own writing, over-the-top satire that was meant to be as defensive as possible. Quote, "It is not true that the exiled work was not satirical," he wrote. Quote, "All those accusations come from me. They came from my own satirical work. I am a self-accuser, the only accuser, as absurd and meta as this is." And then he tried to put the exile's perfectly offensive satire into context. Quote, "The Exile was produced in a very different world and context. Boris Yeltsin's Russia of the 1990s, when virtuous neoliberals oversaw and ran propaganda cover for one of the most horrific and disastrous experiments on a country in modern times." Yeah, the Russians are still rightfully pissed off about that. And most Americans didn't understand how we were implicated in it. But that's neither here nor there. Millions of Russians went to the graves early in the 1990s. Yeah, like 40% of the male population died young. The XX deaths were crazy. It was a complete degradation of a people in a region. We covered the story in an opposite way that almost everyone around us did, satirical rather than objective. The Clinton missionaries propagandizing for Yeltsin were publicly virtuous while lying and looting and laying waste. I mean, we don't even have publicly virtuous figures lying and looting, laying waste, and our liberals give up like when anyone looks at them funny. So, I mean, how are we going to do? There's a Russian reactionary thinker. Who talks about this in a book called Reinventing Collapse by Dmitry Orlov. I was making sure it's Orlov because I was thinking it's not Count Orlov. Anyway, Dmitry Orlov. Now, Dmitry Orlov is a reactionary today, but the Soviet Reinventing Collapse, Soviet example in American prospects, I think is overstated and misunderstood what would cause a collapse. But one of the effectful insights in that book is he said that the Soviets had protected enough of the Russian social infrastructure that as bad as it got, and it got pretty bad, they might actually still have done better than the Americans would do during their long, dreadful decline, which you are probably in. And if you think Trump was our Gorby, I think it was Obama. Although that would make Bush our drop-off. And Clinton our Brezhnev. Never mind, the analogy doesn't work, but still. So we were public or grotesque and moral idiots, but we got the story right. The dominant metaphors for the American colonial project in Russia were rape and prostitution. We took those metaphors as so fundamental to what was really going on, and we tried to make our readers as uncomfortable as possible. We approached this shocking, appalling reality with a shockingly offensive satirical aesthetic. And I'll admit, it's probably very hard for someone in today's America to understand the type of satire that Mark is trying to explain here, without being there in Russia at the time and experiencing that world directly. Although you might experience that world directly now, but it's not going to be the same world because we're going to be shittier at it. I was first reading The Exile back when I was in college in Berkeley around 2001 or 2022, and it totally blew my mind. I'd immigrated to America with my family from the Soviet Union in 1989, right before the whole thing came crashing down. We knew it was bad. My uncle and aunt and a bunch of cousins and a few other distant pockets of our family still lived there. My parents kept in constant touch with them and sent them money. We knew that the new Russia was poor, collapsing, full of crime and corruption, and that people were struggling just to survive. One of my cousins, a single mother with a young kid, desperately wanted to get out. She did what countless desperate Western did at the time. She signed up for one of those mail other bride services, a form of soft, socially acceptable prostitution and sex trafficking, and married a poor public school woodshop teacher in Connecticut. He was a nice guy, but he couldn't get a woman in his own society. Lucky for him, even a poor American loser had the resources to pick a Russian woman out of a catalog. And from that time period, and I do not mean this as a disparagement on Russians, right? It might explain why some of the things are the way they are today. But for example, in Korea, if you are a Caucasian woman and people assume you are a sex worker, they will ask if you are Russian. And it is from this time period, and it's from the desperation it produced. For my cousins, the trade was obvious. Sex and life with a guy that you don't really like in return for a life in America and material support. But in the end, he got more than what he bargained for. Not only did my cousin move in with him, but so did her younger son and her parents. The poor guy got the whole package. So I knew things were bad in Russia, but I never really thought about this stuff too deeply or carefully. I was still too young and had my own immigrant issues to deal with in America. What's happened back in the old country, it seemed too far away for me to care. And when I started thinking about it and started reading The Exile, at the recommendation of my Russian buddy, it blew me away. The Exile described a bleak and horrific landscape, a rapacious oligarchy, looting and criminality on an industrial scale, starvation and exploitation, utter poverty everywhere you looked, and over it, a band of corrupt Western politicians, journalists, and experts whitewashing and cheerleading the horror as a beautiful thing, and also hiding it from their own country. By the way, few Americans understood what role our country played in that, or even that we were doing it. I mean, it's hard to remember how hard it was to get good information about foreign governments before the internet. Even in 2001 and 2002, people were going nuts just about having regular access to the BBC that wasn't just an hour and a half at midnight on an NPR channel. Thank you, Yasha, for giving me a flashback to my own 20s. Ugh. All right. This wasn't the Russia that I read about on the news or heard about through the Soviet immigrant grapevine. No one I knew talked about it this way. It was like reading Sod. I was titillated and disgusted. No way could this world be real. Well, as I found when I went back to Russia for a few years, it was real. I can't finish it. But there's a lot more here. Needless to say, Matt tried to throw a former colleague under the bus for something they didn't even do. Doesn't make anyone feel good, does it? I've seen a lot of this kind of behavior a lot in my life. Matt Taibbi is just one of the more famous ones. I can't tell you a number of people who will mock me for having principles or call me a loser for settling for a middle-class life so that I can have my principles without having to go hunt for more people here on these apps to give me more money to fillet them with ideas that they think I should fillet them with. I've watched people get captured by the audience and then try to stand up to it and get screamed at. You know, I'm not playing that game. I will not be remembered that way. And I don't need the money that bad. I'm not a Nepo baby. My father is dead and was a con artist. My mother was a waitress until I was 19 and was a nurse for only a few years before she nursed Jackied herself. And my stepdad, who did come from money, but his family lost it all before him, was a mechanic. I went to a state school, and I've had a pretty extraordinary life, but it's been luck, not nepotism, that's got me there. Notice I'm not claiming merit. Matt Taibbi bothered me because at one time he seemed to have principles, and he would even set out amongst the crowd. But at his most liberal moment, the way that people ate the air came on him. Now, we've been in denial about the excesses of this, but also cancel culture was always something that we're given towards. It changes sides, and you've seen it before. Don't be fooled by these games. Josh is right. Protect your peace. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, and maybe touch some grass. Do whatever. Take care.